Do you remember the Holden Astra? A lot of people do, and some of them quite fondly. And General Motors hopes that you do too, because after 2 years in the wilderness, the brand is back in the Australian market. Now, it's a little bit more interesting this time because it's not a Holden Astra, it's an Opel Astra. Now, Opel is General Motors' sort of European brand, so that gives them the opportunity to put this car in a prestige place with a prestige price tag. What else is interesting is it allows the company to differentiate this car from that car, and that's the locally made Holden Cruze, which at the end of the day does much the same thing and is much the same size. So the question is, does the quality inherent in this car get it over the line with its bigger price tag? And while we're at it, we thought we should also throw some of the other players in this market segment into the mix, the Ford Focus and the Volkswagen Golf. So this should be interesting.
The recently arrived Astra lobs into the already crowded small car segment with big hopes attached, bringing with it a whiff of European prestige and the solid backing of General Motors. It's also trading heavily on the goodwill behind its former Holden badge namesake, with which it shares its platform.
The dynamic highlight of the Astra is, without question, its ride. It combines pretty plush ride quality with good wheel control, and believe me, that's not something that every car maker gets right. Beyond that, you can feel that there's a fair bit of platform and driveline commonality with the Cruze. But the gearbox in this car does work better. It's got a better idea of what gear it needs to be in and a better sense of when it needs to be there. For me, the disappointing aspect of the Astra is its interior. It's not as wide as the Cruze, and frankly the back seat is pretty terrible. Also, the plastics seem a bit down market to me too. I mean, this is a prestige product. It should have a prestige feel, and I'm just not feeling the love.
Meanwhile, the Cruze is the only Australian-built car here, and apart from its obvious patriotic appeal, has established a decent slice of the small car pie by offering sedan and hatch variants with a choice of petrol and diesel. We're driving the range-topping SRI V model with leather seats, sat-nav and bigger wheels, although for the purposes of price parity, we're basing our comparisons on the cheaper SRI variant.
The big thing in the Holden Cruze's favour is that it feels almost half a size bigger as a car. There's more room inside, both in the front and particularly in the back in terms of shoulder room and headroom. It really is noticeably bigger inside. Unfortunately, that's where the good news ends, because it's a little bit plasticky and it's also quite a noisy car inside. The ride's a little bit firm for some taste, although it does handle okay. But for me, the big letdown is the gearbox. It's too slow to react when you floor the pedal. So even though the motor does the job, the gearbox really lets the whole package down a bit.
Ford's Focus is Drive's reigning small car of the year, and it comes into this contest with an impressive reputation to protect. The Focus Sport's naturally aspirated 2-litre engine is the only non-turbocharged 4-cylinder here, giving it a plainly different character from its rivals.
The interior of the Focus is pretty busy. There's a lot of buttons and a lot of switches scattered all over the place, although scattered's probably the wrong word. There is some reason to it. But it's a very quiet interior. It's probably one of the nicest cars to sit in, and that's largely because the seats are absolutely the pick of the lot. The back seat's better than the others, and the front seats are more supportive and more comfortable, which is a pretty neat trick to pull off. At 2 litres, the Focus has the biggest engine. The other cars have 1.4, but of course with turbos, which this car doesn't have. And as a result, this car is very smooth, but it lacks a little bit of urge in the mid-range. So until you really get it revving hard, it doesn't make as much power as the spec sheet suggests it should. So it's good, but it's not great.
Last, but certainly not least, the Volkswagen Golf is another former Drive Car of the Year winner, both in its category and overall. It's due for replacement next year, but the current model is still regarded as one of the class benchmarks. We're driving the 90 TSI model.
Of all the 4 cars here, the Volkswagen Golf is probably the most dynamic. It certainly steers the most accurately, and it has what you call the best sidestep. But for all that, it doesn't come across as a hot hatch or a sports car. It's still very comfortable and very usable, and does all the things you'd expect of a family hatch. The engine and gearbox are a bit of a highlight too. The gearbox is much more decisive as a DSG than the conventional autos in either of the General Motors cars. And the engine in this car, like the General Motors cars, is still a 1.4-litre turbo, but it just works better. It's a sweeter engine, and it always seems to be on the boil. You're never waiting for the turbo to spool up. It's always on for it. The interior is roomy and it's quite simple, but I kind of like that. And I guess you'd call it simple but effective, and I think really that's a metaphor for the whole car. right from the outset, this comparison was as much about these two General Motors stablemates as anything else. And it really is quite interesting to see how much componentry they share and how similar they feel in some important areas. Ultimately though, the Astra has the refinement over the Holden, and that got it over the line in this case, and it's also, in this specification, a little bit cheaper, which is interesting. But in this company, both those cars are relegated. The Golf has an awful lot going for it. It's always been a good car, and even now it's dynamically the pick of the bunch. But the Ford Focus is refined, it's sophisticated, it's very easy to drive, easy to live with, great standard equipment, and it has that brilliant DSG gearbox. And for our money, it takes home the gold.